Let's start with a word of prayer. Well, gracious God, pray that you would come to us in this time as we contemplate the nature of evil, and over the course of this course to be renewed in the sense of what it is that you are doing about or amidst the evil and the suffering that we see in the world. So may your Spirit indeed bless our conversation and bless our hearing, that we would receive the word that you have for us through the community of faith. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So just an overview, by the way, Evil and the Justice of God by N.T. Wright. This is many of you already have a copy or see, this is a copy of the book that we're going to be studying. There are 5 chapters, 5 weeks in the class, which kind of go one chapter at a time.
And this is for YouTube purposes.
And for YouTube purposes.
Yeah, okay, that's better.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So anyway, we do have more copies that are available downstairs. If you'd like to contribute toward the cost of them, I think they're $12. And if you're wondering, I'm not expecting that you've read anything for today. So there's always a little bit of that anxiety, so don't worry about that. We will be covering some of the material from chapter 1 and kind of getting acclimated here. And then next week we'll take a look at chapter 2, and in chapter 2, N.T. Wright will look at how evil is addressed in the Old Testament, and then we'll kind of go on from there. So all right. And maybe just another word too, that it's interesting. I was talking to a pastoral colleague who was saying that he finds N.T. Wright a little harder to read and easier to hear. And I think for me, it might just be the opposite. I've heard him speak and I'm like, whoa. What is interesting though, so this book is actually from, I think, a series of lectures that he had done that he's kind of retooled a little bit. And so you get a sense of both worlds, I suppose, of his speaking. You can kind of hear him speaking through some of the pages here of the book, as well as, some of that things you might plan out a little bit differently as you're writing. So, but I would say that, just kind of work your way through. I think he is good at coming back to what his point is. So even if you don't know all the names of the philosophers and theologians and so on and what they're, I think 90% of the time or so, you're going to be able to follow without getting into the weeds too much. So
he didn't get too deep into them. I mean, he just mentioned them.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and it might be the way my brain works, but I see those and I'm like, oh, because I flash back to seminary, like I'm supposed to know all these people,
Yeah.
So, anyway, and another reason we won't get too deep into the book today is because my copy that's underlined and marked and everything is at home. And so this is one I just grabbed from downstairs. So, but I think there's plenty for us to talk about, and we have a little less time than normal. So, but I want to just ask, how would you define evil? Let's get some thoughts out there. How would we define evil?
People doing negative things to other people or to the society and.
Okay, so things that people might do to other people that are negative.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'd say the complete absence of good.
the complete absence of good. Okay.
Stan and I talked quite a bit about that. Can an inanimate object or a thought, I mean, a big thought like, I don't know, I guess fascism, can that itself be evil? My take is that it's in the heart of people. But he starts off that maybe he's contemplating that things or events could be evil. But those events or things start off in the heart and the mind of a person. So I'm just wondering what people's take is on that. Can a war itself be evil?
Or can a natural catastrophe be evil?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Cause a natural catastrophe does not start in a human, but,
No.
I mean, I guess we could be adding to natural catastrophes humans, but like a hurricane or something, but a war for sure is thought about.
A war is one of the classic examples that people cite when they talk about evil. The fact that we arrive at a war in the first place indicates significant moral failings.
And in any war, you have people that might otherwise be considered good or whatever, being asked to do horrendous things.
I like the fact that he quotes Solzhenitsyn, that when he got out of exile in prison, he went back to Russia and was fraternizing with people who had, formerly been oppressing him. And I like this line here later in the chapter. He says about why he was doing that. He said, "No," he responded, "the line between good and evil is never simply between us and them. The line between good and evil runs through each of us."
That's good.
And I thought that was pretty
Yeah,
significant because it does. We clearly capable of doing evil. I think of Cain and Abel early on in the Bible. And why would he slay his brother? I mean, they just something there within us is capable, except capable like such things, unfortunately.
Funny when our heroes have feet of clay and we're surprised.
other ideas.
My son had this experience where, it was very intimate and it was very like, I don't know how to describe this. But there was this other that was whispering in his heart or in his mind to do something which would have, well, I can tell you the whole story. There was someone in his community that was in a broken place, so she was living in their house as a way of being sheltered. So he's newly married, and this woman who happens to be like, she's gorgeous, and she was broken. And it's like she was in the safety of their home. Felt this other like presence saying, "You should kiss her." And it wasn't like it was coming out of any kind of lust or anything like inside of him. It was like this other. And then he kind of looked at that idea for a second and he saw this whole hellhole literally kind of open up, like what that would do if he followed that impulse, right? And he recognized that as like an intimate experience of evil. It's like, oh, where did that even come from? And you can see the unfolding consequence of it. So anyway, I throw that out there as like this gist of like, is it other? Is it completely other? Like our classic Christian, there is this evil, there's this presence, there's this fallen angel, whatever it is that is outside of us even that tempts us to behave in horrible ways.
Any other?
In psycho, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say not to oversimplify, but to me, it comes down to either an intentional act of, badness or neglect to do good. Whether it's to conserve energy and contribute to global warming or killing your brother, those are things we're responsible for.
In psychology, we tend to define evil as extreme self-interest to the point where you do not consider the harm that your actions cause on others, or you see that it is causing harm and you just do not have empathy. Or you just do not care about the consequences because you're getting what you want.
Right. That makes sense.
what images come to mind when you think about evil, like now? We mentioned like some, Old Testament, or, but like in our present day, when you think of evil. Or in span of your lifetime or something.
So. There is and I do it in pop culture, there's sort of this distinction in between what we call cartoon evil and actual evil. Or real evil. And cartoon evil is sort of like Skeletor or Cobra Commander, or like the Decepticons from the cartoons and TVs and stuff like that. Like bad guys in movies and things like that, who are evil, but they're interesting or attractive, and people tend to want to like emulate some of their characteristics because they're not actively harming other people, they're just kind of acting like Yosemite Sam. But then when it comes to like actual evil, we're talking more along the lines of like the Nazis, or any serial killer, or pick your preferred billionaire. Right, those would be excellent examples, I think, of actual evil.
Yeah, even in the case of wealth and inequality or something like that, or disparity, you can think that there is something, whether we would call it evil, or if there's a spectrum of something that's unjust, would that seem to be a form of evil, right? If that's, even from the title of the book of the evil and the justice of God, so something that's unjust in some form is evil. Maybe we think of that on a lesser scale than some other kinds of things, but they point out ways in which say that creation and the balance of life, perhaps, that God had intended, is not being exercised.
So one of the questions I have is suffering itself evil?
Is suffering evil?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about, so who was it that mentioning natural disasters? It was somewhere over here and then over here. Actually, I don't know who said it. But when we were talking about natural disasters, because when you talk about phrases, especially from the Old Testament, that discuss like God causing the rain to fall on the good and the bad, sort of looking at natural occurrences happening to both good people and bad people, there is sort of this implication that you can view natural disasters on some level as causing evil, and it would operationally define evil in that case as harm or suffering. So I think that there's a case that you could make for that. But I also don't know if I can morally hold a hurricane to account for what it did, because it's very even-handed in the way that it distributes its force, right?
I think though there's another question with that, is how does God use suffering? I think that's another question added to it.
Right,
Yeah.
because if you consider suffering evil,
Then
immediately the problem of evil becomes a major challenge to anyone's faith, because that puts the responsibility for suffering squarely at the feet of God.
the other question I have goes along with biblical things, understanding of Satan itself and the demonic. I had a college professor or a seminary professor who spoke at at a regional pastors conference, who talked about his experience of the demonic in Nepal and how he struggled with that for a long period, for a period of time. I don't know what longer, a period of time. He, I can't remember his name right now, lived here in PA.
Oh.
So that also has to come into account.
Yeah.
Where does Satan and the demonic have to do with evil? Because I believe it does.
And we'll see that kind of further on down. I mean, because actually in the Old Testament, we'll see in the next chapter, that Satan, I mean, the concept of Satan as we understand today, is not really developed until more into the New Testament, or intertestamental than in the Old Testament, where Satan is like, it literally is adversary is the word. So, yeah, well, yeah, hold some of those thoughts this week, yeah.
It's coming.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. Well, in the Old Testament, we'll kind of skip a little bit down, and actually, this might be a good place to get, if people want to grab a Bible, so we can look at some of these passages to see,
That's your
that-
cue.
that's a cue, somebody, yeah, and so while they're doing that, what are some images we think of evil in our modern time? So it could be Satan or demonic forces,
The KKK,
KKK,
Nazis.
Nazis.
That one? Okay.
How many more do we need? I'm pass them down.
Who needs the Bible?
Who's the Bible?
Yeah, some people are looking up on their phone too, so.
It's Bible.
Carol, you want one?
They're so big. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just read Psalm 29:10 today,
Yeah,
Oh,
if you were in the first. Yeah,
so in the scriptures, particularly in the Old Testament, well, in the New Testament too, in that time, the sea was seen as a place of evil, of chaos. Probably in part because, well, I would think that probably be the case even for more seafaring peoples, Israelites not particularly seafaring. But there was a fear of, of the sea and what it represented. And if you've ever been out particularly in a small craft in rough weather, that fear can come on pretty quick. So there's a number of passages here, and I thought we could kind of look through some of them and get a sense of what do they say about the sea and about God. So 29:10, are you open to that?
yeah. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever.
How about 93? Somebody,
I can-
yeah, 93, 3 and 4.
I got this up. Okay, the seas have lifted up, Lord, the seas have lifted up their voice, the seas have lifted up their pounding waves. Mightier than the thunder of the great waters, mightier than the breakers of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty.
What does that say? Does it suggest God using the powers of the sea?
Floods have lifted up. It says it's another example of staircase parallelism. The floods are the primeval chaos waters that, according to early creation themes, were in opposition to their creator from the beginning. In ancient creation stories, these watery powers were lesser deities that were subdued in heaven by the triumphant high deity. Here, the floods are God's creation, joining their voices in praise of the majestic deity.
What?
So basically, it's saying that okay, so where did the flood thing, it talked about what were the legends they came from? Which culture or the flood, the chaos flood, it starts with a C. The Canaanite, yes, thank you. So the Canaanites had all this stuff about the waters being chaos and stuff, and then it became seen as, well, God actually created these and the water is actually praising God.
Psalm 77. 16.
The water saw you, God, the water saw you and rise, the very depths were convulsed.
So God has command over the seas. Thing on some level, but what's also the problem?
People die there.
Fishermen get swallowed and yeah, and
Yeah, I mean, the seas, there's still chaos in the
Yeah.
world, right? And maybe one more, Psalm, where were we at? That was 77,
Yeah.
114, 3 and 5.
The sea looked and fled, the Jordan turned back. That was 3, and 4 is, 5 is, why was it sea that you fled? Why, Jordan, did you turn back?
So the crossing into the promised land, remember when the priests went forth with the Ark of the Covenant, when they stepped in, the waters parted.
Mhm.
Where else did the waters part on that same journey? Red Sea, right? So, very symbolic, God having power over the sea or the waters, and this, the river is a little different, but, so. But then in Daniel 7, and I pulled this one up, in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and a vision and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and the 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one that looked like that, so on, that these are rising, rising up out of the sea. So, what do you see, I guess, in this, as far as these are visions of judgment? So how does the sea come into play here?
It said in here, his thought was, this is when the concept of evil arising from the sea was first really conceptualized or put down. Evil comes from the sea.
Anybody remember Revelation 21 off the top of your head?
Yeah, the sea was no more.
Yeah, the sea was no more. But we sing the, is it Holy, 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 the glassy sea,
Yeah.
right? So knowing what we know now about the sea and chaos and evil and things, what does that tell us in this vision of the heavenly realm?
No chaos.
No chaos,
evil.
no evil. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So we're left with, this great comforting peace, that God has power over the forces of evil and chaos, but then also left with wondering, why is that still around? Right? By the way, we won't go into these other passages, but you can take this home if you want to look up, more the story of Noah and the flood, the crossing the Red Sea, or, again, Jesus stilling the storm. And, the symbolism that is in there. In the first chapter, Wright, he wants to look at sort of what he calls the new problem of evil, kind of in this modern or postmodern time. This book was written, I think it was about 18 years ago, it was published. So, perhaps a little bit dated. I think at the same time, I think there's enough that kind of rings true. Today, you could probably substitute other things for 9/11, right, or whatever, right? Yeah.
It's a very pre-pandemic book,
Yeah.
right?
How the pandemic, do you think?
Oh my gosh, I didn't expect, like, every possible conceivable view of the way that evil works in the world. Just because of our responses to it or lack of response to it. There's lots of layers to unpack on that.
Nuanced from like a specific,
Oh, yeah.
event as like
Oh, yeah. Because there was so much that happened in 2020 forward with, honestly, take your pick, like even going into like the start of the Ukrainian war. If you just kind of remember all of the things that were going on in 2020, so many people's ideas of evil and what it looks like really changed during that time, because that's where I think a lot of more of the psychological definition of sort of seeing people reacting to major events with extreme self-interest instead of the Mr. Rogers response, which is to look for the helpers, which was the way he dealt with September 11th. A lot of the people that like when I work with my students now and I talk with them about the psychological definition of evil and the concept of evil, they don't really argue with me about it. It's not oh no, evil is just a myth. And they're like, yeah, evil exists. And they see themselves as living in the consequences of the evil that has been done to them by older generations. Does that make sense? Because they have to deal with the effects of climate change, the very bad response to the pandemic, which is still going on in a lot of ways, or the political climate that they have to navigate in, and most of them just don't want to get shot simply for going to school. So,
And I've read so many times about the number of kids that are in mental health crises and
Yep.
seeking counseling. And the numbers of regular folks that are in mental health counseling has escalated.
yep, and I see that
tremendously.
firsthand. A lot of the students that I work with now, they're very interested in mental health because the definition of mental health changed during the
Yeah.
pandemic.
Yeah.
It went from being about just psychological disorders to what do I do to take care of myself? Because the assumption is no one else is looking out for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely no one. The government's not going to do it. Companies aren't going to do it. If I find friends, family, or teachers or other people who actually care about what's happening in my life, I am fortunate, and that's good.
But they don't know what to do about it.
About what?
About the situation that the kids are in as far as mental.
Oh, no,
health.
they know exactly what to do about it.
Ignore it.
No, they don't ignore it at all.
Oh.
My students are amazing, and I have learned from them how to talk about these things, because they are the ones who are out there inventing the vocabulary and finding the words to speak out about what they're dealing with. They are very, very clear on what evil is. Like, that is not a problem. And that's where I think that this book is a bit out of date, because he's like, well, because he lapses into talking about postmodernism, which sort of assumes that there is no evil, but that is not the experience that I've had over the last 5 to 7 years with my students. They are clear cut on what evil is. They're just doing their best to survive it. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So I want your response to this quote from Wright. It's in the middle of the page here, where he's talking about, he's critiquing the Enlightenment idea of human progress. It's sort of assumed. Quote, that the world is basically a good place, and that its problems are more or less soluble by technology, education, development in the sense of westernization, and the application of Western democracy and capitalism.
That's a laugh.
But I think it's been true in our society, unfortunately, for a long time. I mean,
For
that
certain people.
we've seen
Yeah.
for certain people, yeah, that
Yeah.
we've seen ourselves as, oh, you know, we've got this handle on Western democracy, so we're gonna go out and save the world, and if they become like us, then they'll be fine and whatever. And yeah, more technology, more, yeah.
Right.
What laughable, what, yeah,
Bob, speak.
oh.
I don't think it's laughable. I mean, I think the idea is that, the idea that we're gonna take out and show the world how we've done it so wonderfully is one thing. But to say that Western civilization hasn't provided some progress, I think is just kind of lunacy. I don't know, I've read this book that was even How Scots Founded the Modern World, and it's full of all those colonial ideas about, how we know everything and we're gonna go out and save the world and all the rest of it. But it is fascinating if you just take their premise, which is if you watch human history and see how we've become more civilized over time, what we're discoursing about is so different over time. It's like, are we gonna go spear these people in the village next door to? How are we gonna try to communicate at the United Nations? We don't all get there, and there's tons of stuff that doesn't get handled that way, but there's at least some structure and attempt to do things on a rational basis. And sometimes the rational basis itself becomes evil. In terms of, here's what the basis we're using.
Right.
I think the idea that creating social structures and trying to figure out how they work hasn't progressed over time is, I don't know. But every once in a while, I'm also struck by, you can read all this stuff and you think, oh, we've become brilliant about this, and you just pull out Aristotle and realize that, thousands of years ago, people had already discussed all of this and figured it out. They didn't solve the problems either, but they certainly recognized them. But I don't know, I have trouble with the fact that we kind of like throw out Western civilization just because, yeah, it's part of the problem, but it's also, there are some elements in there that are parts of.
Sure, yeah.
I think the problem is that it becomes a dichotomy and that's where I feel like as a Christian, we have this kind of place of understanding and in seeing both sides of it, that yes, there are things that we have a responsibility for in making things better. And I think if we sit around and just say, well, evil is sin and so there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, and there are Christians that sit in that camp and just say, I'm gonna wait till the world ends or I die, whatever comes first, right?
Right.
So that side is not helpful. But also we can fix everything and everything is gonna be perfect and there will not be suffering and there will not be pain is not realistic either. And like Stan's question of, is suffering really evil or is there just inevitable and therefore we have to figure out how to work with it, right? And learn from it. And I think that's what's hard, is it's somewhere in the middle and people don't like in the middle gray, they like answers. And so they either go in the camp of, well, we're just gonna throw up our hands in the air and say, this is it. Or you get the other side that if everything doesn't end up perfect and exactly the way we want to, well, then we've failed. And that's not realistic either. And so, I don't know, it's messy.
I agree that we have to look at both sides. But to say simply that the world is progressing and progressing in a positive way is not completely true. If you take, yes, the pandemic, if you take World War II and all the things that are involved with that, if you look at all the different things that have happened, then you have to struggle with those issues.
Yeah, well, I guess, it's more, and a lot of it's more scope we're talking about, because I think if you're comparing the Middle Ages to today,
Yeah,
well, have we made progress?
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. I mean, we may not identify it in the last couple of hundred years, maybe we've gone backwards in a lot of respects, but I mean, I think if you look back far enough, I think the elements of what we call Western civilization are all entirely evil.
No, I don't think they're all entirely evil either.
So I kind of wonder what the question would be if we say, what has Christianity? What role has it had in, is the earth and the story of progress somehow the responsibility of those who call themselves believers? Have we changed the world? I don't know what the world would look like without it. But some of what we have done in that name has also been harmful. That's a good question.
Yeah, and some of the things that are done in Christ's name could even be considered evil, right?
Exactly.
But a lot has been good.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the same question, only from a little different perspective.
And yet it's not as simple as like a ledger,
Yeah.
like on balance, four more good things than bad things, I mean.
And in some ways, we should be held to a higher standard,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so that's, if there's things in the secular world that happen, like you get why humans do what they do, we're called to something bigger and better and more holy. And so in some ways, we are held to account in a much stricter way because that.
And just the whole idea of power within the framework of Jesus' teaching, how it's used and what is called power and strength. As compared to what we see, like the victor always writes the history. Well, that's not, how we think of Jesus or following Jesus. We will never be quote the power that's writing history.
And yet people are divorcing themselves from churches at a heavier rate now than they've ever seen. How does the chaos that's going on in our world for the last more than a couple years. What role does that play in the reason why people are leaving Christianity or leaving the
Everything.
church behind, the organized
Everything.
church?
Everything.
Of course.
My students and most young people, when they define evil, the church is their textbook definition.
Is it because the church has not solved the problems or there isn't peace?
The church is the biggest perpetuator
Yeah.
of evil in the
Yeah.
world, according to them.
Yeah,
And I
I've read
don't
that.
think they're 100% wrong at all. I think, because when I have students ask me questions, like this week, a brand new intro to psych class. When we were talking about cognition and belief systems, one of my students raised her hand and asked, so why do people bother still believing in religion? And the whole class was like, oh yeah, that's a good question, why?
Yeah.
Because from their point of view, it's just evil. And it does not produce any good at all whatsoever, because when they look at us, they see the KKK.
I would add too, though, that not just since COVID, but probably 10 or 15 years before that, the advancements that we saw in technology contributed to the problem. Not as a solution to access information, but as a problem isolating ourselves from other people.
Social media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so where students and people in general can access one another on their terms and not necessarily become part of a community in the same way that we grew up doing so.
Like you get to choose who you interact with
Yeah.
instead of having to deal with who you're
It's a
actually part
consumeristic
of.
approach
Right,
rather
and
than
because then you-
a congregational.
Right.
Cause then you get your echo chamber and.
Right.
Which, and the algorithms are actually designed to do that.
Exactly.
They are supposed to put you in groups that echo what you're saying. And
Exactly.
as we have done newer research on those, we've discovered that social media is basically a super highway developing like racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, transphobia, like you name it. It seems built to create those things and built to divide us.
Do the young people read mainstream media? I don't
No.
think so.
No, what's that?
Yeah.
Newspaper, you're super old.
Yeah.
Gross.
So they've
So
developed
no.
these ideas.
But the newspapers aren't helping either.
No.
I would
Big-
disagree with that.
I don't know, because a lot of them are owned by billionaires now and they are completely that they are
Yeah.
reporting on the news,
I
so.
would disagree, but go ahead.
So,
My question though is, if your students look at the church and see KKK,
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I understand that.
Because the church hates gay people. Because when
Wait a
someone's
minute,
trans,
wait a minute.
What church
See,
is
that's,
this?
that's.
the church as a
This
whole,
is their.
this is what they're saying,
This is
right?
That's
reading on
exactly
social
right.
media.
So
Yeah.
where are they getting that information?
Yeah, social
From
media.
their personal experiences with the church.
Oh.
I have worked with so many gay kids, trans kids, even just kids who've had questions or were interested in science, who were abused by church members, sexually assaulted by church members. I have had to counsel multiple people who have struggled with suicidal ideation due to their interactions with church. So I am not going to. It's not just that they're hearing about it from culture or social media. When people, especially the students that I have worked with, are rejecting the church, it's 100% because they've had firsthand experience with it.
I understand that.
one of the things in this first chapter he talks about is that, one area where we fall short is when we look at evil and we begin to, have this dichotomy, like it's kind of a, us or them or something. And that part, I don't know if it's along the line of what you're sharing, but Solzhenitsyn, but that evil runs through us, right? And that there's, we are capable of good and capable of harm. I mean, we've all said things, that it turned out to be hurtful, even if we didn't, mean them to be, or if we did, and so. Yeah, I think this kind of touches on one thing in the course of this is that I don't know where we're gonna end up in the end after, contemplating over the course of 5 weeks, the nature of evil and so on. But there's no easy or maybe satisfying response, I think. So, or fully satisfying, I guess, we just have to be prepared with that. Trying to skip around a little here, one thing you can, as you read through, you'll see where he talks about the new problem of evil, and in these 3 statements, we ignore evil except when it hits us in the face. We're surprised when evil hits us in the face, and we react in immature and dangerous ways as a result. I'll just throw in one thing, because he mentions, this book is dated, and he talks about, 9/11 and, the axis of evil and things. And I remember George W. Bush talking about rooting out evil. And I preach, and I can't remember, I have to go back and see if I can find notes from that. But I remember that, and I was like, you can't do that. And it's certainly not gonna be done through weapons of war. Right? But that is one of those, knee-jerk or immatures or, dangerous responses that we have, to when we see and experience evil, in the world. Now, anyway, there's different ways you can look at it and say, well, what's justified, not justified, and everything. But man, look at the effects of 9/11 and its response. And the response to it. And then, also look at the fact that, what has been done or not done, vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, where, right, many of the people were from, and whether the government, supported that in some fashion. So there's all kinds of things, right? We can look at experiences with, ethnic cleansing, and we can look at the war in Gaza, Darfur. I mean, there's plenty of examples. So that's something you kind of contemplate a little bit. How, well, in the couple minutes we have, I'm gonna skip to this quote from him, that the Christian belief growing out of its Jewish roots is that the God who made the world remains passionately and compassionately involved in it. So how does the statement address the problem of evil in the world?
Well, I think the gospel addresses it in the cross. I know in John, he says, and this is the judgment, that light is come into the world, but men prefer darkness because their deeds are evil. So I think the reality is there is a solution to sin. And, it's a reality that God sent his son to save the world, not to condemn it. But that reality is ever present. But you have to admit that there is a problem with sin in our world, and that rectification came through the cross, through Calvary. How the rest of you think that, but that's.
Well, just the example of Jesus, like he was passionately and compassionately involved in the world that he came to be a part of. And the way he interacted with people and the way he treated people, and he didn't come to be a power source and to cut down the big evil, right? A big evil in a different way, right? But not like the world political evil. That's not what he was here to do. And so I think sometimes, I guess the question I ask is, are we asking God to do something that's not the purpose for what he's here for, or for what we're here for with him? I don't know.
So when I think of that, I have visions of people in my life who I feel are doing that. And it is God through them doing that. It's not a global thing. It's a very personal thing. To be passionate and compassionately showing and living. We just don't feel like we make a big enough difference. At least I know that's, you know, there, we feel so limited in how much impact we have.
And to your point, I think we do know a lot of people who choose the darkness.
Yes,
Mm.
yeah.
But like your sermon last week about Anna and Simeon, you know, and they announced that he was gonna bring a whole new order to the world and yet a sword or some cause for concern because, you know, there's gonna be a conviction with what Jesus came to say and do, but yet we just went over what that book a few weeks back, right? Prince of Peace, Mighty God, the things that Jesus is, you know. And he's all those things and more. You know, he closes the first chapter when he says, talking about evil. Like he says, there's also another 4-letter word, LOVE.
Bottom of the page there.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the one I think when we think about the gospel is focus on LOVE for our world. Yeah.
Well, any word you have for, I mean,
You can take it home. Sure.
yeah,
Session.
I know, I just didn't, you wanna throw in frying the compost. Things from today that you wanna share next week, bring those, as well. So, yeah, let's pray. Lord, attend to us as we continue to contemplate these very heavy questions about evil in the world. May we not lose sight of your love and your presence in the world as well. So guide us and stir up enough within us to awaken us to your presence and the presence of darkness as well in this world, that we can work with you in the work of restoration and reconciliation.
Like, it was really interesting. This kind of.
So